Hey, what's up everybody? All right, today we're going to be looking at IDs and classes in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, how to set them up, how to select them in each one of those, and how to use them in JavaScript through document.querySelector and querySelector all. So what we're going to do is just hop right into this. So we're going to open up a new folder in Visual Studio Code. So you just open up Visual Studio Code, you click New Folder or Open Folder, and we will just go ahead, create a new folder here. And open that up in VS Code. All right, so once we're in here, we're going to create an index.html file. And in the index.html file, we will type HTML, and we will allow this pre-generated code to go ahead and populate the basic HTML information. So we'll go ahead and fill in this page title, and we'll go and call this ID class. We press tab, and with this pre-generated code, excuse me, with this pre-generated code, we can just tab between these different highlighted fields right here and fill out that information as we need. So we'll call this one style.css, and then we'll tab over and call this guy script.js. Press tab one more time, and here we are in the body. So we'll go ahead and save that, and we can go ahead and make a couple files in here, and let's go ahead and do that style.css, and the other one was script.js, so we'll make that also. And then inside of here, we'll do a document.add event listener DOM content loaded. What that's going to do is anything inside of here will only fire after the DOM content is actually ready to start listening. So what we can do is add in a console.log hello and welcome to the JS file. We save that. And a nice little thing we can do. So by the way, this is the terminal, which is built into VS Code. Let's say we didn't have this open here. On a Mac, you can press Control and then tilde, which is going to be that key. Also where the back tick is in the top left, to the left of the number 1 key and above the tab key on most keyboards. So if you do Control and then that key, you will toggle the terminal window. It also has these tabs for other things, but for right now, we're going to use it for terminal. So now that we're in here, we can do an ls, make sure that we are in the correct file, which is this ID class, and we are. And we'll just go ahead and open this. And we can do a new window of Chrome. Drag our HTML file in there. And here we have a blank page because we don't have anything in the HTML body, but if we inspect it, we can go to console and see hello and welcome to the JS file as we put in here. So now that we've done that, let's add a couple things to index.html. So let's add 3 things here. So we'll add an h1, and we will say this is our header. And then let's do a div, give it an ID of my ID, and say this is the ID div. And then we can say div, give it a class of my class, and we'll say first class here, and we'll copy this. And second class here. So if we go back to Chrome, refresh the page, we've got our header, our h1 tag, and then we've got our 3 div tags with the ID, the class, and the other class. Okay, so let's look at some things we can do. First off, basics of CSS. we have okay. We have our HTML file here in the middle. We have our script.js over on the right side and our style.css on the left side. So give ourselves a little bit more room here. Now what I'd like to do first is select the H1 tag. H1 tag, we're going to give it a color of, actually, let's give it a background color of, let's say FFF. No, that's white. Let's say CCC. There we go. Don't forget those semicolons after each statement. And we can say style, let's see, can we do border bottom 1 pixel solid black. Okay, if we refresh, then we have a background color of gray, and we have a solid black 1 pixel bottom border. So a little bit of styling on there. That's how we select this and add to it through CSS. Okay, all we do is select that H1. If we come down here and select another H1 tag, and we say, here's another H1, and then we refresh this page, it's going to have the same style because what we did in CSS was we just selected all H1 tags. And we said, apply this style to all of them. Okay, so now we have that. We can also do that same thing with divs. So if we say div color blue, this is going to change all of our divs to blue. Why? Because they're all divs. We're just saying select all the divs, give them a color of blue. So those are how you select by an element and apply classes to it. Now, we can get even more fine than that. We can get more granular. And the way we do that is through classes and IDs. So since we have an ID on here, and we have our classes on here, let's go ahead and try working with them in CSS. The way that you work with an ID is you're going to put this hash or number sign or pound sign, whatever you would like to call it. Just think in your head, when you see that, that means ID. Okay? So if you see hash my ID, think about it like ID equals my ID, just like we have over here. That right there in HTML is used like that in CSS. So now that we have that selected, we can say background color, and we'll just set this to, how about 999. There we go. So we'll have a little bit of a darker gray. Or actually, let's make sure that separates out a little bit. So we'll just say 666 and give it a little bit more of a distinct gray from that top one. So now you can see that this ID has been selected and that class has been, or I'm sorry, that style has been applied to it. And we can say color white to make the text pop off of that just a little bit. And let's just add a little bit of padding to that to give it a little bit of space. Okay, so what we did here was we selected our ID and we applied these classes to it. Or I'm sorry, these styles to it. We applied these styles to our ID. You can see that because an ID is more specific than a class or than an element, this white is going to be selected over that. Now, one of the things about CSS is that if you have a selector up top, if you have two different selectors, so let's say we have div and then we have a div and it's color red. Now, the one that's below is going to be applied. So you can see here that even though both of these, this is perfectly fine to do, you don't really want to do it because this is just unnecessary. So typically you want to avoid that. Okay, but what happens, the point that I'm trying to make here is that the second or the final div that applies to that is going to be the one that's used. Now, here's the deal. If I put this div color red down below here, what do you think is going to happen to the color? Is it going to be white on that ID, or is it going to be red? If you said white, you are correct. The reason is because an ID is a more specific selector than an element. So even though this div's color is set below this ID's color, the ID's color is still going to be applied because that is more specific. Now you can read about this online. There are different levels of specificity. There's elements are a higher level, and then classes, and then IDs. IDs are going to be the most specific. They are going to overrule any class or element that has the same style applied to it. Note that this div down here, note that the style actually has to be overwritten. So if we have this padding right here, that padding is still going to be applied to this ID div because this ID does not also select padding. This ID doesn't care about padding, but this div does care about padding. Now this color is going to be overwritten as white for the ID, but the padding is also going to be applied, and it'll actually be applied to all three of these. Now my point is that now it's going to be overridden if we went in here and said padding 10 pixels for this one. So it'll still be 5 pixels for the other divs, but now it'll be 10 pixels for this ID. All right, now that we've done that, we can look at class also. So let's look at my class. Okay, so that's right there. That's how you do a class. The pound sign hash number sign is for an ID. So you put the number sign and then the ID that you selected. For a class, you put a period, a dot, and then you put the name of the class. So it's very, very simple. It was something that confused me a lot when I first started, but it is really, it's nice. It's easy to work with once you just learn that. The number sign and then the ID name selects that ID, the dot, and then the class name selects that class. So now that we've done that, we can add something like a margin left of 10 pixels. So we'll stick a margin in there, and we'll also stick let's say a border left 1 pixel solid black. So now that's going to be applied only to both of these classes right here, both of these divs. And as you can see, it is. And we'll also add a margin bottom of, let's say 5 pixels, just to separate these out a little bit. Okay, so that is how you do let's add a margin top in here of 5 pixels also. This is just me being, I don't know, a little bit OCD here is just moving these apart right here. So that's how you do it. That's how you do a element selector. That's how you do an ID selector and a class selector. Now I can apply this class to other things also. I can now say this has my class, and anything that's inside of my class is now also going to be applied to the ID. Now the thing is, if there's any styles in here that apply both to the ID and the class, the ID is going to overrule it. For example, border left, let's say 10 pixels solid green. So we have a border left in the ID, we have a border left in the class. The ID and the class are both applied to this first div right here. The one that's going to get applied is the ID because that's more specific. So now we have a 10 pixel wide border left that is green on the ID. And it also has these other ones, these margins, because those are not overruled by the ID. They are on the class though. All right, so that's that. So now let's look at JavaScript. JavaScript is very nice with its ability to do query selectors. I don't know what iteration of JavaScript, what update of JavaScript added document.querySelector, but now that you don't have to do getElement by ID or whatever the other ones were, you can select anything on the DOM on the page with query selector, and it is extremely nice. especially once you learn the basics of CSS and working with, nested CSS elements, nested elements inside each other, multiple class selectors and subselectors, and all of that type of slightly more advanced CSS stuff. I mean, CSS doesn't get too crazy. It can be annoying, but it doesn't get too complicated. But yeah, so here's the thing. You work with it the exact same way. Document. All right, we have our document. That's the entire page. The document is the page. Inside the document, we have our HTML. We have our head, which is the invisible part, which is going to have things like the title and metadata in it. As you can see on our page over here, we have our character set, our meta tags, link, script. It's got all that in here. It's just the head. And in the body, we've got the stuff that's actually visible on the page. Okay, so document. Document is an object. What can you do with objects? Well, you can do methods. So you have one called querySelector. Not going to do anything if you don't put anything in there. You got to have something in the querySelector. Let's put some string of something or other in there. And for our folks coming from some sort of, I don't know, C# or something like that, we'll put double quotes in here so that you can see it's a string. But really, this is the exact same thing as single quotes in JavaScript. It does not care, single quote, double quote. Doesn't matter. So we'll actually go back to single quote just because why not? So if we type a div in here, it's going to happen. querySelector. It's going to select our first div. querySelector selects the first one of its type. There's multiple divs on the page, but we're only selecting the first one of its type because we did querySelector. Great. How about this? querySelector all. Boom. Now we've got a node list. Inside that node list, we've got all 3 divs on the page. Everything that can be selected in this is selected on this node list right here. Now we can do, the node list is not a, what is it called? The node list is not an array. It is a node list. So you cannot perform array functions on the node list. What you can do is loop. So you can do for each item, console.log item. There we go. And we just log each one out. So remember this, when you are using document.querySelector all, you're selecting a node list. So you cannot map through each of those. You cannot filter, you cannot reduce, you cannot do array functions on those, but you can do a for each loop, or you can do something like, say, let's say var my divs here equals this. And then you can say, you can do a for loop, right? So for var equals, whatever. That's pretty cool, huh? All right, so for var equals my divs here. And we say console.log. Well, now this is not an array. So what's not going to work is this. Oh, it is going to work. Okay, well, there you go. Learn something new every day, huh? So you actually can loop through each of those and actually use that as an array. So, all right, I guess we're all learning something here today. Okay, so now that we've got that figured out, document.querySelector, querySelector all. The great thing about this, you'll notice that this div selector is exactly the same as this div selector right here. What does that mean? Well, that means that we can also go up to this class selector. And if we copy that and stick it in here, .myClass, there we go. We have our .myClass. If we do a querySelector all now, we have all of the elements of my class. Okay, so let's take this back out of here so that we're not just selecting all of the divs every time. So we have that removed from the first one. We save it. We can just press the up button here in the console and do a document.querySelector all of the class, my class, hit enter, and then we have our node list selecting the 2 that have that class applied to it. All right, so what else can we do? Well, if we can do that for elements and we can do that for classes, what would make sense is, yes, we can do that for IDs. So here we have an ID. Okay, so you do document.querySelector, you stick an ID in there, and then there you have it. There's your ID. So if you're messing around with something like forms, like input fields and whatnot, you're going to want to probably give each one of those its own unique ID. And then what you can do is you can go in here and set, I don't know, let's say we have some inputs here. Yeah. So we have an input like a date, name is date, ID is date, input. Okay. And then we're going to have input, and we can say checkbox, name, check, ID, check, input. And then input, text, name is text, ID is text, input. All right. So if we refresh, we got our checkbox, we got our text field, and we've got our date picker in here. Isn't Chrome great? I love this. Okay, so here's what's going to happen. What we're going to do is we're going to set up variables, and we're going to say date input equals document.querySelector, date input we're going to say check input, we're going to say text input. And we'll remove this line up here just because we don't need that anymore. If we see these guys, then we know that we're in our script file. Okay, so we'll hop back over to Chrome, refresh the page, and there we've got date with our date, check with our check, text with our text. And now we can do things, now that we know what we've got here, we can do something like date input dot add event listener. Let's say click, and we can say function event and console.log the event. Okay, so what we're doing is we're setting that element to a variable, and then we're adding an event listener to it. So using that query selector, we've selected that ID. We've set it to a variable, or a constant in this case, so that we know that we're not going to change it again. That's why you use const, one of the reasons. So date input, we add an event listener of click to it, and then we're just going to console.log that event. And it's going to happen every time we click on it. Just console.logging that event. So there you have it. That is how you use document.querySelector. That's how you use classes, IDs, and elements in CSS and in JavaScript. I hope this was helpful to you, and everybody take care. Have a great day. Happy New Year.